Hello everyone, so glad you're here. Occasionally, life presents us with a moment that utterly arrests us. A realization dawns. That quiet figure in the periphery isn't just another face, but someone burdened with more than we can possibly fathom. Yet most remain oblivious until a single courageous act transforms everything. In an instant, silence yields to reverence and a forgotten soul becomes indelible. What catalyzed that shift? Who stepped forward when all others hesitated? And why does this narrative continue to send shivers down our spines? Stay with me because what unfolds next is truly unforgettable. Before we delve in, please hit that like button. Share this with someone who understands that genuine heroes seek no spotlight. And in the comments, tell us about a time you witnessed pure compassion. And of course, subscribe for more stories that will linger with you. They assumed they were merely apprehending another man in chains. But by the time the unvarnished truth surfaced, the entire city of Boston would be forced to confront the true meaning of justice and who among them possessed the fortitude to stand when it mattered most. The doors of the Suffolk County Courthouse groaned open, their weight seeming to carry more than just wood and metal. The air within was stagnant, thick with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the restless shuffle of a crowd awaiting the next mundane case. Yet nothing about that morning's proceedings would be routine. The murmurs ceased abruptly as two deputies escorted in a tall, broad-shouldered black man, his wrists bound by cold steel. The faint scrape of chains dragged across the polished floor. His name, announced by the bailiff without a hint of ceremony, was Malcolm Ward, accused of obstructing a law enforcement officer. It sounded insignificant, trivial until you truly observed him. Malcolm didn't move like a man charged with a petty offense. He didn't cower beneath the weight of their scrutiny. He didn't bow to the public spectacle they aimed to make of his arrest. His suit, though rumpled, was meticulously neat, clinging to a frame sculpted not by vanity, but by years of quiet discipline. Streaks of gray traced his temples, the kind that spoke more of endurance than of age. He settled into his seat at the defense table with a deliberate composure, as if the shackles were mere threads of paper. He didn't even acknowledge the public defender fidgeting awkwardly beside him, nervously leafing through notes. Across the aisle, Officer Lucas Kane, the young white cop who had orchestrated Malcolm's arrest, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. His eyes tracked Malcolm like a predator observing cornered prey. But there was a fragility in his posture, something that betrayed the pride he clung to. Kane had bragged to his precinct buddies that Malcolm was just another angry vet who got in the way at Boston Common when officers confronted a group of teens. Mouthy old hero complex, Kane had sneered to anyone who'd listen, a line designed to reduce a man to a crude stereotype. But in this room, surrounded by strangers, Kane appeared diminished. The gallery sensed it, even those unaware of the deeper current. Seated a few rows back was Clara Whitmore, a seasoned judicial oversight observer. Her white hair meticulously coiled into a bun, a scarlet scarf draped over her shoulders. She had attended hundreds of hearings, most of which blurred into a hazy continuum. Yet the moment Malcolm entered, her pen froze mid-note. Her eyes narrowed, not with suspicion but with a quiet recognition. She leaned forward slightly, her notebook forgotten in her lap. She knew that stance, that profound stillness. She had only ever witnessed it in rooms where destinies and nations hung precariously in the balance. The judge, Harriet Colton, a woman whose years on the bench had etched more creases into her robes than compassion into her gaze, cleared her throat and peered down at Malcolm as if seeing through him, not merely at him. "Mr. Ward," she intoned, her voice clipped and cold. "Will you be accepting representation today?" Malcolm lifted his gaze not to the judge, not to Kane, but to the national emblem behind Colton's head. The eagle, the shield, the words "E pluribus unum," etched above the bench. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, low, the kind of tone that hushed every other sound in the room. "I came here to be judged," he stated, "not to explain." The words weren't loud, but they struck like a hammer. Conversations in the gallery ceased entirely. Even the court reporter's fingers hesitated for a half-second before resuming their rhythmic tap. Kane shifted, his smirk faltering. He clenched his jaw and turned his gaze to the floor, feigning review of his statement, though the faint tremor in his hand betrayed him. He waited for Malcolm to falter, to lash out, to provide him with something to point at and declare, "See? That's the menace I told you about." But Malcolm simply sat, his hands loosely folded, his breathing even. For a long moment no one moved. The case log was read. The prosecutor droned through sterile legal phrases, but none of it registered. All attention was riveted on the man who sat without a word, his mere presence commanding more weight than any argument could. In that profound stillness, the atmosphere of the room began to subtly transform. Clara's pen slipped from her hand, clattering softly against the floor. The gallery straightened in their seats. Even the bailiff, a man who had witnessed his share of boisterous defendants, found himself glancing Malcolm's way, unable to shake the conviction that this was not the man the file claimed he was. And as the chains on Malcolm's wrists glinted under the courtroom lights, catching a reflection that flickered across Lucas Kane's face, the tension settled, heavy and unspoken. No one articulated it, but the question was already echoing between the walls. Who exactly had they shackled? And what would happen when the truth they were all avoiding finally came to light? What transpires when a man forged for conflict, a man who has borne burdens unimaginable to most, finds himself battling not with weapons or adversaries, but with profound silence in a room where every gaze demands his collapse? The Boston Federal Courthouse felt colder that morning, not from a draft, but from something heavier, a palpable stillness that resonated in the hushed conversations. People's voices dropped to a murmur as Caleb Ward was led in, wrists bound, ankles chained, a man of quiet dignity forced to move like a common criminal. The deputies announced his name without ceremony, flatly like an item on a docket. Yet the distinct clang of those shackles dragging across the tile compelled every head in the room to turn. Caleb did not appear defeated. His suit was wrinkled, the gray at his temples more pronounced under the harsh fluorescent lights, but his back was ramrod straight, his chin steady. He wasn't there for spectacle. He didn't flinch at the gallery's whispers, nor did he glare at the white police officer across the aisle, Officer Randall Rick Stanton, the man who had cuffed him in a public park days earlier. Rick sat with arms folded, jaw tight, exuding the same smug control he'd displayed since the arrest. To him, Caleb was merely another agitator refusing to comply. But there was something in the way Caleb moved, the way he carried the weight of those chains, that unsettled people in ways no words could. He offered no resistance, no pleas. He simply walked as if the cuffs were paper, as if none of this could touch the essence of who he truly was. Judge Meredith Renshaw presided from the bench, her expression fixed in a practiced bureaucratic mask, impatient, more concerned with the docket than the man before her. She inquired if Caleb would accept court-appointed counsel, her tone flat, as if reciting a script spoken 1,000 times. Caleb raised his eyes for just a moment and spoke for the first time. His voice was low, even, yet it rippled through the room like a nascent fault line. "I came here to be judged," he declared, "not defended." It was neither defiance nor arrogance, but the calm conviction of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding that some truths required no argument, only time. The words hung in the air. For a fleeting moment, even the stenographer ceased typing. People shifted in their seats. Some frowned, others stared, and Rick Stanton's jaw flexed harder, his fingers drumming impatiently on his bicep. The prosecution commenced its case with rehearsed confidence. Rick, their star witness, appeared crisp in his uniform, his narrative tight and polished. He painted Caleb as a hostile agitator, a man who had intervened without cause in a lawful police operation, who had raised his arms as if to strike, and who had refused to follow commands. There was no footage, no body cam, no third-party witnesses, just Rick's words and the half-hearted corroboration of Officer Marcus Davis, a veteran cop who sat silently at the prosecutor's table, his gaze unusually distant. Each time Rick emphasized a word like threatening or belligerent, his eyes flicked toward the jury, assessing their reactions. It was a performance, every inflection carefully calibrated. But the more he spoke, the more a subtle discomfort permeated the room. For despite his conviction, something in his story didn't align with the profound stillness of the man shackled at the defense table. Among the observers, one woman had already stopped taking notes. Eleanor Brooks, a seasoned court monitor with silver hair and keen eyes. She had attended hundreds of hearings, most of which blurred into an indistinguishable stream. But Caleb Ward was different. His composure was too deliberate, his silence too measured. She had seen men break under less pressure, seen defendants plead, shout, or crumble. Caleb sat like stone, his eyes fixed not on the jury, not on Rick, but on the American seal mounted high above the judge's chair. It was as if he wasn't merely in the courtroom. He was observing the room itself. As Rick droned on, Eleanor studied Caleb's face, a flicker of recognition tugging at the edge of her memory. She had worked on federal oversight boards, sat in classified hearings, and witnessed men who bore the weight of decisions the world would never know. Men who understood that silence could resonate louder than protest. Caleb possessed that same stillness, that same unspoken gravity. When the prosecutor paused to pour water, a rare moment of quiet descended upon the room. Caleb's eyes never left the seal. The gallery's murmur faded. You could almost feel the tension tightening, a silent question beginning to take hold in every mind present. Who exactly was this man they had shackled? Then, as if to puncture the moment, Rick Stanton took the stand again, leaning forward with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled the narrative. He smirked faintly, his eyes darting toward Caleb. His words sharpened, each syllable designed to sway the room toward his version of the truth. He was defiant, disrespectful, and unpredictable, Rick declared. He dared me not to do my job. That trifecta, defiant, disrespectful, unpredictable, was sufficient to sway many rooms. It was a well-worn recipe, one that transformed too many black men into threats with nothing but tone and implication. But as Rick spoke, Officer Marcus Davis shifted again in his seat. He wasn't nodding in agreement. Nor was he glaring. He simply stared at Caleb, his brow furrowed as though trying to place him, to reconcile the quiet man before him with the menace Rick described. And in that quiet something began to fracture. Not loudly, not obviously, but like the first small crack in a dam. Eleanor Brooks leaned back in her seat, her eyes narrowing. The court clerk stopped shuffling papers. Even Judge Renshaw glanced down briefly, as though sensing the balance in the room beginning to shift. Caleb Ward hadn't spoken again. He didn't need to. Every second he sat there, composed and unyielding, made the accusation sound a little thinner, the performance a little hollower. And though no one said it aloud, everyone could feel it. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was the genesis of something far more significant. The air inside the Boston Federal Courthouse had grown thick by the third day of Caleb Ward's trial. It wasn't merely tension anymore. It was a palpable pressure, a weight settling on the shoulders of every person present. By now, whispers had escalated to murmurs to silent, knowing glances, as people began to ponder what no one dared voice aloud. Why did a man like Caleb Ward, composed, silent, bearing himself with a quiet dignity that felt almost out of place, seem more like a witness to this trial than a defendant? For 2 days, Caleb had allowed others to dictate his narrative in that courtroom. Rick Stanton spun his story with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being believed, leaning on words like defiant and unpredictable, while Judge Renshaw seemed content to let the case grind forward as just another hearing on her docket. But those who watched closely, Eleanor Brooks in the gallery, Officer Marcus Davis at the prosecution's table, could discern the emerging fissures. There was something beneath it all, something no one was yet naming. And it was Eleanor who finally shattered the silence. It began during a lull, a procedural pause as the clerk recalibrated the recording equipment. Most of the room had slumped into its usual courtroom lethargy, eyes downcast, awaiting the next testimony. Caleb remained perfectly still at the defense table, his hands loosely clasped, his gaze steady on the national emblem above the judge. But Eleanor was leaning forward, her notebook closed, her silver hair catching the dull overhead light as she rose. At first no one noticed. A woman standing in a courtroom isn't unusual. But then her voice emerged, not loud, not shrill, but firm, cutting through the quiet like a strike of flint. "This isn't just a defendant," she stated. "This is Caleb Ward. And I need to ask, do any of you truly comprehend who you've chained here?" The murmurs ceased. Judge Renshaw glanced up, her expression tightening. "Ms. Brooks, you are here as an observer, not a participant. Sit down." But Eleanor did not sit. Her hands trembled slightly, though not from fear. Her voice grew steadier with each word. "I spent 3 decades monitoring federal oversight hearings, classified reviews, and military tribunals. I have witnessed hundreds of men walk into rooms like this one. Some guilty, some lost. But I know what I saw when Caleb Ward walked through those doors. That posture, that restraint. This isn't a man resisting justice. This is a man who's been carrying something the rest of us cannot even measure. Rick Stanton shifted in his seat, his jaw tensing, his confidence momentarily cracking. Objection, Your Honor. This is completely out of order. Renshaw's gavel struck once. Ms. Brooks, any further disruption and you will be removed. Eleanor took a breath, her eyes sweeping across the room. Remove me then. But someone here has to say it. This isn't just about what happened at that park. It's about the fact that a man who's given more to this country than most will ever know is being dragged in chains because someone decided silence meant guilt. Caleb hadn't moved during her speech. His hands remained folded, his gaze still locked on the emblem above the judge's seat, but his eyes flickered just briefly toward Eleanor. Not gratitude, not surprise, just acknowledgement, like a soldier nodding to another who finally understood the battlefield for what it was. The gallery stirred. Even those who had come only out of curiosity straightened in their seats. They could feel something shifting, like a current pulling the room in a new direction. Officer Marcus Davis, who had remained silent throughout Rick's testimony, now leaned forward slightly. His hand brushed the table, fingers tightening. A memory tugged at him, a face seen years ago, perhaps in uniform, perhaps standing in a line of men being honored for something only whispered about. Rick stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His voice rose, sharp and defensive. Enough of this. She doesn't know him. None of you do. He was hostile. He interfered, and he made a scene because he thinks rules don't apply to him. That's all this is. But his words didn't land as they had the day before. There was a tremor beneath them now, a hint of someone realizing his script might not hold. The gallery's eyes no longer followed his agitated hands. They watched Caleb, watched how he didn't flinch, didn't meet Rick's anger with anger. That stillness was louder than any outburst could have been. Eleanor turned toward Rick, her tone soft but unyielding. You're right, Officer Stanton. Most of us don't know him. But I do know this. Men who stand the way he stands, men who carry silence like armor, aren't forged in city parks. They're forged in places where survival is measured in seconds, and where speaking out can cost more than staying silent ever could. The room fell so quiet you could hear the hum of the old overhead lights. Judge Renshaw's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in reluctant curiosity. Even she could sense it now, the balance shifting, the narrative fraying at the edges. For the first time since the trial began, Caleb moved slowly. He unfolded his hands and rose to his feet. The chains around his wrists clinked softly, a sound that resonated through the silent room like the deliberate ticking of a clock. He didn't look at Rick or at the judge or even at Eleanor. His eyes swept the room, meeting each pair of eyes one after another. Not to plead, not to accuse, but to hold them there, to make them feel the weight of their own watching. Then, in a voice low but steady, he spoke. You all crave noise. You all want something to point at. But I've learned that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stand still. So I'll keep standing. It wasn't a roar in volume, but it was the kind of statement that filled every corner of the room, the kind that didn't fade when the echo died. The gallery didn't clap. They didn't gasp. They simply sat there, still, as if someone had placed a hand on each of their shoulders and commanded them not to move. Rick's jaw tightened, his eyes darting nervously between the jury and the silent man in chains. Marcus Davis leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his gaze fixed on Caleb with something close to recognition, perhaps even respect. Eleanor lowered herself back into her seat, her fingers closing around her notebook again, not to write but to steady her hand. And as the judge banged her gavel to call the court back to order, it was clear this trial wasn't just about Caleb Ward anymore. It was about everyone in that room, about what they chose to see, about the uncomfortable truth pressing in from every corner. The silence had spoken. And now the roar was beginning to build. Not from Caleb but from everyone who could no longer pretend this was just another case. The courthouse was meant to be the conclusion. The gavel had fallen. The charges against Caleb Ward were dismissed, and the public believed justice in whatever form had been served. But justice doesn't cease at a courthouse door. It lingers, permeates, and expands, especially when the truth stubbornly refuses to remain buried. By the time Caleb was escorted out of the Boston Federal Courthouse and onto a government-chartered flight, the story had already escaped the confines of polished wooden benches and vaulted ceilings. It dominated every news outlet, whispered in boardrooms, and flooded social feeds faster than anyone could contain. And as the plane cut through the clouds that afternoon, It became chillingly clear. This story wasn't landing quietly. It was descending like a seismic shockwave. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was tense but superficially calm. Caleb sat near the back, hands now free, but his posture still upright, every inch of him radiating the same profound calm he'd carried into the courtroom. Across from him sat Captain Rivera, her uniform crisp despite the turbulence. She wasn't just an escort. She was there because she comprehended the storm that was about to break outside. On her phone, encrypted messages buzzed every few minutes. Pentagon briefings, media alerts, corporate statements, all scrambling to distance themselves from the burgeoning fallout. She didn't share the details with Caleb, but she didn't need to. He knew the weight of a gathering storm even if he couldn't yet see it. By the time they were 30 minutes into the flight, the first wave had struck. Major networks were replaying trial footage. Not the testimony or the gavel but him. Caleb Ward, shackled and silent, rising with a dignity that compelled an entire courtroom to stand without a word. The clip spread like wildfire. Hashtags bloomed across every platform. Words like #hero, #betrayal, and #reckoning trended side by side. And behind closed doors, phone calls commenced. Calls between government officials, airline executives, corporate sponsors, and PR firms, all consumed by the same panicked question. How did a decorated veteran end up in chains? And who allowed it to happen? At 35 minutes, Rivera's phone chimed again. She glanced at the screen, her jaw tightening. "They're calling this a systemic failure," she murmured almost to herself. Caleb raised an eyebrow but remained silent. She continued, her voice lower. "Now the department's not just investigating the officers. They're auditing the entire chain of command, the city, the contracts, the companies tied to the officers' training." She hesitated, looking at him for the first time in a way that wasn't merely procedural. "This isn't just about clearing your name anymore. This could bring down careers, maybe entire divisions." Caleb didn't flinch. He simply shifted his gaze to the small oval window, watching the clouds peel away beneath them. "Let it," he said quietly. 3 words, steady as steel. At 40 minutes, the turbulence began, not from weather but from the immense pressure building on the ground. News broke that one of the private contractors linked to Officer Rick Stanton's department had financial ties to a major defense corporation headquartered in Boston. Within minutes, the corporation's stock began to plummet. By the time Rivera received her next alert, a senior executive had resigned, and the board had called an emergency session. "Corporate earthquake," the message read in bold. But the true aftershock arrived at 45 minutes. An urgent transmission illuminated Rivera's tablet. A no-fly directive was being prepared, not because of Caleb, but because the plane itself had become a liability. With every passing minute, more eyes were turning toward it. Cameras were already waiting at their destination. Reporters poised to swarm. Someone somewhere decided this could not be a quiet landing. The directive was simple: divert the flight. Keep it controlled. Minimize spectacle. Rivera's expression hardened as she read it. "We're diverting to Andrews," she finally told Caleb, meeting his eyes. He didn't respond immediately. "They think putting you out of sight will cool this down," she added. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze calm yet piercing. "They think silence means surrender," he said at last, echoing words his wife had once written. "They're wrong." At 50 minutes, the intercom crackled. "Attention passengers, this is your captain. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at Andrews Air Force Base. Please remain seated." The cabin murmured with confusion, but Caleb stayed still, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee, as if counting down to something only he could perceive. When the wheels touched down on the tarmac, the world outside was already ablaze. Protests had erupted outside Boston Police Headquarters. Stock tickers scrolled in red. A Pentagon spokesperson addressed the press, carefully selecting words like oversight and corrective measures, while studiously avoiding others like injustice and cover-up. And inside a glass tower overlooking the Charles River, a defensio stared at his phone, pale, realizing that one man's silent stance had just cost him billions. As the plane taxied to a halt, Rivera leaned toward Caleb. "Once we disembark, they'll try to move you fast. Cameras will be kept back, but they're waiting. Everyone's waiting. Whatever you do, however you choose to walk out of that door, it's going to echo." Caleb looked out at the runway, the faint hum of engines vibrating through the floor. For the first time since leaving the courthouse, he let a small breath escape, slow and deliberate. Then let it echo, he said softly, more to himself than to her. Outside, under the harsh lights of Andrews as the cabin door creaked open, and the first gust of night air swept in, the storm Caleb Ward never asked for was about to break wide open. And this time no courtroom walls could contain it. The roar of the engines faded as Caleb Ward stepped down from the plane, the night air of Andrews Air Force Base cool against his face. Floodlights illuminated the tarmac, casting his shadow long across the concrete. No shackles this time, no courtroom walls to contain the immense weight of what had unfolded. But the silence wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that precedes an inevitable crescendo, when the world holds its breath, anticipating whether the man at the storm's epicenter will rise or crumble. Caleb did neither. He simply continued walking, steady and deliberate as cameras, though kept at a distance, captured each measured step. Across the country, screens glowed with his image. Cable networks replayed the trial footage alongside live shots from Andrews, while commentators debated not just his case, but the very institutions that had brought him to this point. Some labeled him a symbol, others a reckoning. But to Caleb it felt like none of that. He wasn't a symbol. He was simply a man who had stood unmoving while the world attempted to dislodge him. And now that stillness had ignited something far larger than himself. By morning, the ripples had swelled into undeniable waves. Officers Rick Stanton and several others were placed on immediate suspension pending federal investigation. The Boston Police Commissioner held a press conference, his words stiff and meticulously scripted, acknowledging failures of procedure, while artfully sidestepping the word that permeated every headline: disgrace. Outside the department headquarters, people gathered not to chant Caleb's name, but to demand something they couldn't quite articulate: respect, reform, something that might prevent another man from being dragged through such humiliation before the truth had its day. Caleb observed it all unfold from a quiet government safe house on the outskirts of D.C. Rivera sat across from him, briefing him on the ongoing fallout. Corporate contracts unraveling, city officials scrambling for self-preservation, and a Pentagon statement in the works to clarify his decorated service record. She asked if he wanted to speak publicly, to take the podium and reveal to the world what had been done to him. Caleb shook his head. "The noise won't help," he said quietly. "They'll twist the words until they mean nothing. The silence is what they heard. But silence doesn't end a storm, it only shapes it." And soon, other voices began to emerge. Not his, but the voices of those who had witnessed, who had been present, who had felt the weight of what happened. Eleanor Brooks was the first. She penned an op-ed for the Boston Globe, not as a legal observer but as a citizen. Her words were steady, deliberate. "Some men fight wars abroad. Others, like Caleb Ward, remind us why we cannot afford to let another war begin here, between those sworn to protect and those they are sworn to serve." The piece spread rapidly, picked up by national outlets, shared across social platforms, and echoed by veterans groups who began organizing their own statements in solidarity. Soon after, Officer Davis, the seasoned cop who had watched it all unravel in court, recorded a short, unpolished video from his kitchen table. No badge, no uniform, just a man staring into the camera with weary eyes. "I got it wrong," he said simply. "We all did. And if we can't admit that, none of us deserve the uniforms we wear." His voice cracked halfway through, but he didn't edit it out. The video went viral within hours, not because it was polished but because it was real. And through it all, Caleb remained silent, not as an act of withdrawal but as a deliberate choice. While his name trended, while his story ignited debates in Congress and corporate boardrooms alike, he sat quietly in a park just outside the safe house one morning, watching the sunrise. A boy wandered up to him, no more than 7 or 8, clutching a toy jet in his hand. "Were you a hero?" the boy asked, his voice curious, not awed. Caleb smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. "No," he said softly. "I just stood where I had to." The boy didn't fully comprehend, but he nodded anyway, then ran off, his laughter trailing behind him like a ribbon in the wind. Caleb watched him disappear, the sound a reminder of why he'd stood still when the world tried to crush him, not to prove a point, but to ensure that laughter and the innocence it carried could continue to exist without chains or fear. As weeks passed, the story of Caleb Ward transcended a mere headline. Police academies began using his trial footage and ethics training, not as a cautionary tale about anger or resistance, but as a profound lesson in dignity and restraint. Rivera delivered his service citation in person, not with ceremony but with quiet acknowledgement. And Rick Stanton, once so certain of his authority, resigned quietly, his name fading from the narrative like smoke dissipating after a fire. Caleb never sought to be remembered, but his silence, the kind that made courtrooms rise and corporations tremble, became something that could not be forgotten. Not because he shouted but because he stood. And long after the cameras stopped, after the protests quieted and the headlines moved on, his story lingered like a voice carried beyond the clouds, reminding anyone who heard it of a truth too heavy to ignore, that strength isn't always loud and justice isn't always found in the noise. Sometimes, it's in the stillness that refuses to bend even when the whole world is watching. Caleb Ward's story transcends a single man in shackles. It's about what happens when unwavering dignity confronts raw power, and how silence, when wielded deliberately, can speak louder than any roar. From the moment he was dragged into that Boston courthouse like a criminal, wrists bound, head held high, to the day his name and record were unveiled for the world to see, Caleb's journey became more than a trial. It became a profound mirror, compelling everyone watching, officers, judges, bystanders, and us, to confront an uncomfortable question. What do we truly stand for when the world demands we bow? Caleb, a decorated war veteran who had risked his life overseas, did not retaliate with fists or even words when humiliated in his own city. He didn't shout to clear his name, didn't argue with those who mocked him, and refused to let his anger define the narrative. Instead, he did the one thing that proved impossible to ignore: he stood still. That stillness unsettled the room, pierced through arrogance, and exposed the truth in a way no outburst ever could. In the end, when his record was revealed and the truth became undeniable, it wasn't just Caleb who walked free. It was every person in that room who was reminded what integrity genuinely looks like. But the story doesn't conclude when the courtroom doors close. Caleb didn't leverage his vindication to destroy those who wronged him. He didn't pursue interviews or grand speeches. Instead, his quiet strength generated ripples far beyond what he ever intended. Police academies began incorporating his trial as a teaching tool. Citizens, veterans, and leaders began posing more challenging questions about respect, justice, and reform. Even Officer Davis, the man who had once stood complicit in his restraint, left his role on the force to train new recruits in ethics, hoping to prevent the very mistakes he had witnessed. Caleb didn't demand these changes. His mere presence, his steadfast refusal to bend, made them inevitable. The lesson Caleb's story offers is crystal clear, yet profoundly challenging. True strength doesn't always roar. It doesn't always require a stage, a speech, or a spotlight. Sometimes genuine strength is found in restraint, in understanding that your inherent value needs no external validation, and that silence, when it carries the undeniable weight of truth, can shake foundations louder than any rage. In our own lives, this lesson applies in myriad ways, both grand and subtle. Whether we encounter injustice at work, bias in our communities, or struggles in our relationships, we are often told that making noise is the sole path to being heard. But Caleb's story reminds us that there is another way, that standing firm even without words can command attention and respect in ways that shouting never will, so long as our stance is rooted in truth, not pride. So, as you reflect on Caleb's story, ask yourself, where in your own life do you need to stand still? Where can you demonstrate the kind of strength that doesn't demand applause, but inherently earns it? And when you face those moments where the world attempts to shake your foundation, remember Caleb Ward, a man who stood quietly and compelled the entire room to rise to its feet. If this story moved you, if it sparked a thought, or if it reminded you of the kind of strength our world desperately needs more of, please don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit subscribe to our channel. Every share, every new subscriber helps us continue telling stories like Caleb's, stories the world too often overlooks, but desperately needs to remember. Your support fuels our drive to keep going, to keep digging deeper, and to bring you narratives that challenge, inspire, and linger with you long after they're told. Stay with us, because the next story might just transform your perspective.